The myth began to take real shape on December 15, 1967, more precisely at 17 o'clock. And not just anywhere, of course, but in a city called Point Pleasant, located in West Virginia in the United States. If we wanted to be more precise, we would have to go to the bridge that connects that city with Kanaka, in Ohio. At that time of the day, in that part of the year, and right at those coordinates, a significant traffic congestion occurred. 37 cars were crossing from one side to the other. Not only were people returning from their respective jobs, there were also many people traveling carrying Christmas shopping and huge pines on their roof racks. Of all those men and women, 46 would not reach their destination. At a certain point, a loud noise was heard, a kind of dry thunder. Everyone heard it and for a second time froze. There was a moment before the chaos in which all the survivors claimed to have realized that something bad was happening. They were not wrong. The bridge collapsed, swallowing 31 of the 37 vehicles. Honking screams desperation. The air suddenly tensed and the most terrible images began to fill everything. Entire families were sinking in their means of transport. A man was struggling to climb onto the roof of his truck. Pets that had slept peacefully in back seats were splashing around trying not to die. Other people who were not on the bridge instinctively threw themselves into the water, hoping to be able to rescue someone. More screams, sirens. 46 were the fatal victims of that horrible event. An event that shocked the area but also the entire country, generating a giant panic in relation to the extensive bridges. And not only that, after the famous Silver Bridge collapsed, another kind of fear would awaken. Many were convinced that the incident had a silent culprit. We're talking about a being that exactly a year ago had been prowling the area, causing terror. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. How did the collapse of this bridge lead to the rise to fame of one of the most recognized cryptids? What were its precedents? Who were the first to investigate it? Is it true that this being would be connected with other strange events such as prophecies, flying saucers, and the presence of men in black? And most importantly, where were its last sightings? Don't you know yet what creature I'm talking about? I invite you to come here. Today I will present the curious case of the Mothman. I want to tell you that if this idea and these types of stories interest you, like we did with the Appalachian Mountains recently, this deviates a bit from true crime and those types of videos, so we're trying to target another audience that might be interested in this theme. If you like it, write creatures in the comments, and we have more than 500 people commenting creatures. This video surpasses 10,000 likes in 24 hours. We are going to make a second part, maybe talking about some other cryptid. It could be, I don't know, Bigfoot in that one or the one you want us to talk about down below. So you can also write suggestions, because we are going to take into account everything you ask for. Now let's get started. Panic sets in. Let's move back to a little over a year before the Silver Bridge collapsed. Because while that would be the genesis for the myth to take flight, the horror had already laid its claws in West Virginia much earlier. November 12, 1966. A group of gravediggers was working hard in Clendenin, a city famous for being the birthplace of the world's first petrochemical plant. These men were digging trenches at high speed while murmuring and laughing under their breath. It was hard work, but they were used to carrying it out. What they were not prepared for was what they saw. Suddenly, among the shadows of some nearby trees, they could perceive a movement that stirred some leaves. Before they could conjecture about what it could be, they saw a huge humanoid figure jumping among the leafy branches. Everyone's bewilderment increased when they discovered that the being had huge wings. Then panic paralyzed them, at least until they saw its large, bright red eyes. Immediately, the gravediggers ran off and only stopped when they needed to catch their breath. They didn't know it, but they had been the protagonists of the first official sighting of a monster that would soon become commonplace for the people of the region. And just a few days after this incident, two couples were walking near the area known as TNT area. TNT area. It was nothing more than an area of old military depots used during World War II. After the conflict, the place had started to be used by couples who wanted to get away from the center to walk in peace or have some privacy. That's what these four people were doing when suddenly a creature about 2 meters tall with huge wings appeared from the shadows of a ruin. Again, the factor of the red eyes was repeated, and the fact that the being moved with something similar to jumps. The unfortunate witnesses ran to their vehicles without hesitation. Their consternation only managed to increase when they could see through the rearview mirror that the being was following them. And how did it do it? Flying. And not only that, it was flying at a great speed. They realized this last part because they couldn't lose it, regardless of how much they accelerated. According to what they would declare, it seemed like the humanoid had stopped following them when it lost interest in them. The authorities were not very convinced with the story, especially when they went to the area of the encounter and found no traces or anything else that could serve as evidence. Even so, both couples were reluctant to be taken for crazy. They were equally displeased when the commissioner tried to explain that everything was surely due to confusion. Those who had seen the being were sure that they had not hallucinated and that they had not been mistaken. They had seen a winged man with bright eyes, however hard to believe that sounded, and all four of them had seen it. Could it be possible to talk about his management? Unlike the police, the press did show interest in reproducing this story. After listening to the various conferences given by the witnesses those days, a journalist named the apparition as Mothman. This naming has been a subject of debate, and is it believed that he himself was linked to Batman? Or more precisely, to the television series airing at the time, where Adam West portrayed Gotham's caped crusader. That fiction, with its colorful costumes and bizarre villains, was booming. And there are not a few who argue that it was the influence of comics that made that thing that was terrorizing the neighbors of Point Pleasant get the name it would eventually get. Moreover, Mothman was an attractive name that allowed newspapers to weave mysterious and powerful headlines. Headlines that continued to multiply. A few days later, two friends told the local newspaper that a creature had appeared in front of their vehicle. The headlights had confused it, and thanks to that, the young people had been able to escape. However, they added another key detail. They claimed that as they turned up the radio they were listening to, it had suffered strange interferences. This time, according to what was stipulated, the beast had moved at almost 160 kilometers per hour. How could this be logical? The reports increased as the hours went by. There were people who had found scratches on their vehicles, people who had been awakened by a chilling howl that didn't resemble any known animal. People who had seen a suggestive silhouette passing at high speed among the clouds. People who saw their television or radio fail just before feeling footsteps on the roof. The crowd included people from all social classes and various professions, such as merchants, firefighters, and delivery men. Anyone could become the next to cross paths with the Mothman. And it was perhaps this latent possibility that triggered the panic. In less than a week, the Gettysburg Times reported 8 sightings. The other newspapers had the same luck. There was even talk that some dogs and cats had disappeared from their homes in the early mornings. Alerted, a group of neighbors decided that if the police couldn't do anything, they were going to have to take control of the situation. From one day to the next, many residents started to carry weapons if they went out at night. Paranoia had escalated to unsuspected levels, and the ideal breeding ground had been created for a disaster to occur at any moment. That's why, as the furor for Mothman grew, the authorities said it was time to intervene. In an effort to defuse any potential problems that could arise from widespread fear, the local police called in several professionals to provide a logical explanation for what was happening. That's how they got to Dr. Robert L. Smith, a university professor specialized in wildlife. The man analyzed the cases presented, the descriptions of the victims, and after a few days of consulting his books and notes, he came to a conclusion that soon became vox populi among the skeptics. According to Smith, what had been terrorizing Point Pleasant was nothing more than a Canadian crane that had become disoriented on its conventional migration route. Canadian cranes can be over a meter tall and have bright red skin around their eyes. Could a lost crane be to blame for everything? Had fear distorted the perception of reality so much? From these people who had seen it twice its size and flying at a ludicrous speed? The authorities insisted that indeed that was what had happened. Those who wanted to give more credibility to this explanation argued that it might have been a crane, possibly mutant. What were they based on? Simple. It had been seen, as we said, in an area where there had been bunkers specialized in the manufacture of ammunition. Could it have happened that a leak of toxic chemicals resulted in an animal of enormous proportions? Joe Nickell, an emerging paranormal investigator who over time would be characterized by his willingness to discredit any unfounded claim about anomalous events. He found other reasons for the epidemic of gorilla man sightings. For him, everything had been a snowball that had accumulated more power and density than anticipated. He believed that after an experience probably derived from confusion, a bunch of bored people had taken the opportunity to have fun scaring others. Part of his suspicions were justified when he discovered that a group of workers had tied red lanterns to helium balloons in order to play a prank on their tormented neighbors. Joe also didn't rule out the idea of a misidentified animal, only that, according to his suspicions, it wasn't a Canadian crane, but a snowy owl, also a huge animal. In fact, his research would show that in 1966, coinciding with the time of the most sightings of the Mothman, a man named Ace Henry had shot down an owl in those parts with a wingspan of 1.5 meters. That bird is still on display at the Mothman Museum. These statements, instead of quelling the myth of the Mothman, only calmed it down for a while because it would later return with more and more strength. And the blame for this would be what happened on the Silver Bridge. The Silver Bridge was built in 1928 by the General Corporation and the American Bridge Company and was designed according to the specifications of the American Society of Civil Engineers. It had 2 lanes and a total length of 680 meters, including the accesses. The name Silver Bridge was given because it was the country's first painted aluminum suspension bridge. This caused many people to even come to the area to photograph it. It was a landscape element that everyone was proud of. Even many residents kept repeating that in addition, the bridge had unique engineering techniques such as high-tension chains and tilting towers. For nearly 40 years, the bridge stood majestic over the Ohio River. Beginning in early 1967, a formal commission inspected it and claimed that it was in perfect condition to continue operating for another period of time. However, that's not what happened. On November 15, 1967, the pride of Point Pleasant would come crashing down, claiming a few mortal lives and granting the Mothman a new facet, and that's how our story comes back to the beginning. Bridge Incident. After the rescue of the survivors was carried out, the dead were removed and the fallen vehicles were recovered. The city entered a long period of mourning. During this gray period, exhaustive investigations were carried out to determine the cause of the incident. The first clue was that many people in the West Virginia and Ohio area claimed to have heard a sonic boom at the moment the bridge had collapsed. A sonic explosion, sonic boom, or sonic bang is the audible component of the shockwave caused by an object when it exceeds speed. Mach 1 or sound barrier. Could it then have happened that something produced a vibration capable of generating a structural imbalance in the bridge? Nearby military facilities were investigated, their history of detonations and the flight of their planes were studied. No matches were found. In addition, another report revealed that if a sonic boom capable of knocking down the bridge had been carried out, obvious damage would have had to be perceived in other constructions, such as houses and buildings. In parallel, the oldest residents remembered a peculiar story from long ago, a story that happened in 1774. That year, there was a battle in Point Pleasant between 1,000 white men and 1,000 natives. The latter had been commanded by Chief Cornstalk, who at a certain point had realized that the balance was tipping in favor of his enemies. It was then when he told his troops that they could choose to fight to the death or surrender. Without thinking too much, his men, hurt, decimated, and cornered, preferred to bow to the white man. According to the official history, this event, known as the Battle of Point Pleasant, had led to 2 other important things. Ironically, a peace treaty was signed, and Cornstalk was captured and executed. They say that the man, before being riddled with bullets, had cast a curse on the entire area. Obviously, the story of the indigenous curse did not calm the facts or the reason for the event. And for those who were looking for an empirical explanation of what had happened, they found it shortly after. Apparently, everything had been the result of a failure of one of the plates that formed the links of the bridge's suspension chain. It simply had a small construction defect. On the other hand, the analyses showed poor maintenance of the structure. Not to mention that at the time of the fatal accident, the structure was supporting more weight than it should have. That verdict was unanimous and left no room for mystery. However, the shadow of the Mothman made its presence known once again. And for this, the participation of the writer and researcher Gray Barker was of vital importance. Recent evidence suggests that Barker was skeptical in most of the cases he investigated, but he wrote with fervent belief. For financial reasons, whether it was like that or not. The truth is that he managed to leave a huge mark in West Virginia thanks to his 1970 book called The Silver Bridge. In that work, he linked the fall of the bridge with the previous appearances of the Mothman. He claimed there were numerous accounts from witnesses who had spotted the creature close to the conflict area, among other evidence. Always. According to his reports, the Mothman was intimately related to other uncommon phenomena that had occurred in the area, such as unidentified flying object sightings and the presence of men in black. Those ideas could seem as outlandish as those of the chief's curse, but they were not taken that way by the general public. The Mothman, for some reason, seemed to everyone a more real horror, a horror of which they had a clearer and more contemporary awareness. This was taken into account by another writer and researcher, John Keel. Keel was one of the most influential ufologists since the 70s. It was his second book, UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse, that popularized him. There, he theorizes that UFOs are a phenomenon produced by ultra-terrestrials, beings capable of manipulating matter and our senses. In the past, they manifested as fairies, demons, or deities. Keel explains the title of the book saying, "Our skies have been filled with Trojan horses throughout history, and like the original Trojan horse, they seem to hide a hostile intention." Keel interviewed approximately 100 witnesses who claimed to have seen the Mothman. Expanding on his predecessor's investigations, he concluded that the creature was not exclusive to Point Pleasant and that it had a prophetic power. This idea would be the inspiration for the 2002 movie Mothman, The Last Prophecy, directed by Mark Pellington and starring Richard Gere. Today, the idea that the Mothman appears announcing misfortunes or as a prelude to paranormal events has become very common, not only in its native Virginia, but in other parts of the world. But how is this supported? Well, now it's time for you to believe it or bust. The Prophecies. Between 1976 and from half a dozen witnesses, mostly children or teenagers, claimed to have seen in the Cornwallis region, England, a creature practically identical to Mothman. The description was as follows, and I quote, "It was like a hairy owl of monstrous size and slanted red eyes." It so happens that the appearances of the so-called Cornwallis Owl Man coincided with an increase in unidentified flying object activity in the area. There are documents that speak of the presence of a winged man in the vicinity of Ukraine in 1986. Some believe he would have warned about the Chernobyl accident in March 2009 in Chihuahua City, Chihuahua State. A young man reported seeing the Mothman in Mexico. The boy narrated that he was chased for several minutes while driving his truck at high speed. A few days later, an outbreak of swine flu occurred, causing the death of several people. In 2011, hours before the September 2013 Fukushima nuclear disaster, he was seen in Japan. Mothman was allegedly sighted by several people separately in the city of Santiago, Chile. Several witnesses claimed to have seen it flying in circles over a famous square. Was it collective hysteria? Another lost bird confusion? Uncertain. The only thing that became clear is that after the authorities took the statements, the infamous Valenar earthquake occurred. In 2016, a photo was published that supposedly showed the Mothman. It was taken by an anonymous man while driving on Route 2 in Mason County. The image caused a huge stir, but professionals were quick to say that the snapshot showed a bird, perhaps an owl, carrying a frog or a snake. The route from which the photo was taken was the scene of several accidents in the coming months. And these are just some examples, because after this the Mothman would have migrated to Chicago. In 2017, 3 witnesses independently saw this mysterious being in different places within a 4-hour period. Witnesses also reported seeing a green flying saucer in the skies after spotting the creature. Since then, the city has had over 50 encounters. The sightings are no longer accompanied by collapses or calamities. There are those who say that the Mothman, after more than 60 years of activity, finally found another place to settle. One that is 934 kilometers from where it all began. 934 kilometers that we intuit. The Mothman could have traveled in a very short time, but is he really there? Why did he migrate to that place? Until his death in 2009, John Keel maintained that the men in black were especially focused on silencing witnesses of Mothman. What is the relationship of this cryptid with unidentified flying objects? The connections between things are unclear based on the available information. The only certainty is that, for some reason, this creature manages to be in the right place at the right time. And while it has fed and continues to feed various nightmares, it is also true that a cult has been built around its figure. In 2002, Point Pleasant held its inaugural Mothman Festival, and the following year unveiled a statue of the creature sculpted by Bob Roach. The Mothman Museum and Research Center, established in 2005, continues to expand. The festival, still active and with an attendance of more than 20,000 people annually, is celebrated on the third weekend of September. During it, various events are held with powerful guests, vendor exhibitions, and wagon rides through the areas where the Mothman was seen. On July 26, 2015, the television series The Mothman, directed by Chihuahuan filmmaker Sergio Carn, premiered. Inspired by various appearances of the humanoid giant in Pedro Meboki City, located in the south-central area of the state. In 2022, Mothman Tapes, a fan footage written and directed by Philip Mearns, premiered. The movie focuses on a vain and declining YouTuber who believes he can become famous by making paranormal videos, until he runs into, can you guess who? While tragic, the Silver Bridge collapse had some positive outcomes. Bridge inspections are now more routine and thorough thanks to what happened in Virginia in 1967. Engineers now have more knowledge about corrosion fatigue and stress corrosion. This enables designing and building higher quality structures. With current technology, as well as better design techniques and materials, there is hope that things like those will no longer occur. Since 1969, there is another bridge in the same place where the Silver Bridge was. It was named the Silver Memorial Bridge. Why did the presence of the Mothman become so strong after those years? Some believe the creature's myth represents a desire for immortality, chosen by those who lost their relatives in the 1967 incident. Advocates of this idea believe that by extending the story of the Mothman, many people managed to cope with their grief and found a sense, albeit twisted, in the fatality of fate. It is not a minor fact and even turns out to be a coincidence, but a valuable one at that various ethnic groups from Central and South America associate the moth with death and bad luck. In these beliefs, the moth is known by various names such as Black Witch, Death's Head Hawk Moth, or Butterfly of the Land of the Dead, even though it is not actually a butterfly. Nonetheless, cryptids still fascinate people with their distinctive traits. These are animals that remind us that no matter how much progress is made, nature always has a surprise up its sleeve. Cryptids, moreover, challenge certain accepted precepts, confront us with our fears of the unknown, and tell us about solitary and unique beings. It is no coincidence, according to some researchers, that cryptids are mostly terrifying, but essentially good. Neither Bigfoot nor Nessie nor the Mothman intend to attack us, but they force us to rethink our ability to accept what we cannot explain. These creatures remain fascinating for another reason. It is possible to discredit some evidence of their existence, but it is not possible to discredit the possibility that they may exist, even if it was born out of word of mouth or a mistake or a joke. Once they settle into the collective unconscious, cryptids become real. And, as in the case of the Mothman, they continue to hover over our heads, waiting for the right moment to descend and announce new and terrible calamities.